Hi everyone, welcome back to Book Club. I am so excited for our first talk of the school year, if you will. I have been a longtime fan and reader of Virginie. So about Virginie, she's a filmmaker and novelist. Some of her books include King Kong Theory, Vernon Subutex, Pretty Things. She's known for her work exploring gender, sexuality, and young people living in marginalized conditions. Her first novel, Baise-moi, or Fuck Me, based on her own experience being raped, was adapted to an extremely explicit film in 2000, which was banned in France. It was actually the only movie to be banned in the country in 3 decades. Her early work was heavily inspired and influenced by Kathy Acker, who wrote one of my all-time favorite books, Blood and Guts in High School, which I think I actually have here. I recommend this book to anyone who hasn't read it, and I think it could be a fun pairing with Dear Dickhead, our pick of this month. So, Blood and Guts in High School by Kathy Acker. And we have a really wonderful guest, someone who is way more well-versed in the world of Virginie than I am. Our guest today is Anahid, a poetry scholar, writer, art critic, and the current poetry editor of Granta magazine. Her essays and reviews have also been featured in the New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, which I love, I'm a big fan of, London Review of Books, and more. A little bit about the book before we get into it. Originally published in French and translated and published by our friends at FSG, Dear Dickhead is billed as an ultra-contemporary dangerous liaisons about sex, feminism, and addiction. Ultimately, this is a book about being addicted to the search for feeling something, which is, I think, something we can all relate to. Oscar and Rebecca, old acquaintances, run into each other after years apart. He then posts on Instagram describing her as a wrinkled toad, bemoaning that she looks like a tragic metaphor for an era swiftly going to hell. The novel begins with Rebecca violently emailing him, calling him out for his post. Her email begins, Dear Dickhead. And without further ado, let's bring on Aid.
Oh,
Hi. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm so excited and loved this book so much. And like, you are truly the perfect person to talk about this book with. Okay, should we jump in?
yeah, let's do it.
When did you first become familiar with Virginie's work and what drew you to her?
So I remember when this movie that she made, Baise-moi, in
Mhm.
French, in English, Fuck Me,
Mhm.
came out when I had just turned 18. And it was banned in France, that movie. It was the first movie to be banned in France in, I think, 3 decades.
Mhm.
And I had just turned 18 and it was rated X in
Mhm.
the US. I
Mhm.
was so excited to use my newly minted 18-year-old ID to get into this X-rated movie, like this very, very violent movie about two women that are brutally raped and then go
Mhm.
on a killing spree in
Mhm.
in revenge, and I just found it completely mind-blowing and felt also like there was a approach to feminism that I hadn't encountered before. I went to an all-girls school, and
Oh.
yeah, and I think that the feminism I was brought up with was very soft and gentle, and about this idea that women are maternal and women are caring, and that there
Mhm.
should be more softness and care in our society. And this was about two women just going around with guns blowing dudes away, right?
Mhm.
And I thought,
Mhm.
well, that's something I haven't seen before. And so I've been really into her ever since.
Yeah, and she has this great interview
Yeah.
where she talks about how her experience, because obviously Besma is based off of her real life experience, how that impacted her as a writer. And
Yeah.
she's like, I know I would be a writer either way, but I am the kind of writer I am because of those experiences that I've had.
This comes up in the book too, right? There's a moment where the character Rebecca says this kind of amazing thing of, if you're raped when you're 14, society tells you you'll never get over it. And
Yeah.
I think in her work, there's this really interesting tension between wanting to acknowledge being defined by a traumatic
Yes.
experience, but then also wanting to say, why should my life be reduced to this?
Yeah. I want to talk about the title. From what I understand, the original title translates more closely to Dear Asshole.
Yeah.
Why do you think they chose to adjust it slightly for the English translation?
Dear Dickhead is just so fun. It's so fun
Uh-huh.
to say if you're walking around with a book that says Dear Dickhead on the cover, it's a conversation starter.
Absolutely.
People are going to come up to you. In that way, it reminds me of Chris Krause's novel, I Love Dick.
Oh my gosh. I also have I Love Dick somewhere.
Oh my God, I love
Yeah.
that book. And I remember reading it for the first time on the subway, and
Yeah.
you're just asking people to make
Oh,
clever.
totally.
I mean, I was thinking about that, like the different translations or the French versus the English. I guess I'm not a native French speaker, but
Mhm.
in French, connard, means something more like asshole. And I think that, in English for us, an asshole is somebody who sucks, but not necessarily somebody who's pathetic or lame.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the dickhead in the book, right, Oscar,
Mhm.
is that he's also pathetic and lame.
Mhm.
He's not just a bad dude,
It's so true. I feel like this book is chronically online, entirely living in emails and blog posts and on Instagram, but it's also a classic example of a novel of letters. Why do you think this format, opening up private correspondences to the reader never gets old? Like I've recently been very into correspondences between like Anais Nin and Henry Miller, or
God,
even the poetry of like Jack Gilbert and Linda Gregg, and just this like window inside people's private correspondences. Like, why do you think that's something that we always return to?
you said it basically when you said, oh, I was reading these letters between actually existing people, right? I mean, I
Mhm.
think that the fiction of a novel of letters is that the characters are real people, which we all want to believe anyway. And we
Mhm.
all believe on some level about any novel that we read, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're rooting for the characters to have a happy ending, or you're sad when they're sad. Part of our brain does think these are real people. So that just the effect of the letters is to heighten that fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to read everyone's email. I want to read
I
everyone's text
know.
messages.
Why? Like, why am I like that? It's kind of crazy. And I wish that I feel like sending letters is a dying art. But I think emails also feel like they're dying. So that feels kind of like it's replacing wanting to go back and read letters. This is a bit of a pivot, but Rebecca goes on a rant about the film industry, how it's responsible for connecting masculinity and violence to generations of people. She says, oh, the women we've watched fleeing and sobbing. Oh, the men we've watched armed and frenzied with rage. She talks about the shit coming out of Hollywood and how we, the public, devour it. She says, ages, bodies, classes, races, they make the choice. And with our eyes, ears, we take it in as a model. She goes on, a neurotic society has neurotic rather than healthy reflexes. Consequently, it did not take long for cinema to become what it is today. Cowboys, superheroes, soldiers, warriors, and manic pixie dream girls who are never verbs, only indirect objects. I highlighted, underlined like everything I could with that quote. I think she's specifically talking about women, and that has inherently made her a feminist, but like we said, not in the way that she doesn't understand the eye rolls that come with the feminist name tag, unfortunately. I wanted to talk a little bit about her view of Hollywood and how it's affected the world's view of women.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear you talk about this too, because when I was reading the book, I was in the middle of it and I had just read some of those passages. And I met up with a friend of mine who's a producer. And I said, you need to give this book to every actress that you know, right? Because I'm obviously not in cinema in any way, but I have friends who are, and it really
Mhm.
struck me. I mean, I think one of the things that I really like about Despentes' thinking is that she seems to insist, both in this book and elsewhere, that the thing about sexism and misogyny is they're also really bad for men. Like they
Yeah,
make men really boring too. And so
absolutely.
often when I watch older movies, whether it's from the 40s or the 70s or even the 90s, I think these men are so much more interesting. The women too, but the men are so much more interesting. It's like
Mhm.
now you go and see a movie, and the most interesting thing about the male lead is his abs, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you don't have a sense of like, this is a real person and they have a backstory and they have a family,
yeah.
they have interests and things they like, right? So I
Mhm.
think that that sense of, people being objectified or reduced to caricature holds, for both men and women in film.
Absolutely. I had a really interesting kind of eye-opening experience where I've been acting not that long and I've done multiple sex scenes, and I was talking to a male actor who's been acting much longer than I have, has an incredible career and has never done one. And
Wow.
was like shocked that I have in the few years I've been doing it. And I was shocked that he hadn't. And it really was eye-opening to me. Most of the female roles we're seeing are in relation to a male character
Yeah.
and they're not necessarily getting their own storylines. And I think, Rebecca talks a lot about this in this book.
Yeah, there's that great line, right, where she says to Oscar, who's been canceled, right? She says,
Mhm.
you want to talk about being canceled? Try being an actress over
Yeah,
40. You know?
exactly. And he's so sensitive about it. And that's why I love that she really struggles to find the empathy for him. I also love the part of the book where they talk about how when people used to watch movies, you were watching it from your living room and there was really nothing you could do to change the outcome of the movie. And now with social media, people feel more agency and like they can sort of shift what's going to happen and what they're consuming is. And usually the most efficient way to do that is with negativity. So negative comments, and that has kind of started a breeding ground for all this negativity that we get on social media.
Yeah, no, that seems absolutely true. And then, of course, that's sort of what begins the book, right? Because the first
Mhm.
thing that happens is Oscar writes this, runs into Rebecca or sees Rebecca from across a cafe
Mhm.
and writes this nasty blog post about how badly she's aged and how she used to be so hot and now she's a toad. And
Yeah,
it's just it's kind of unbelievable. I mean, it's a cliche now, but it's true. People say things on social media that you would never say in real life to somebody's
never.
face.
Never. And I also find it interesting because he says that, and it does elicit a response from her. And
Yeah.
then he's like, we were old friends. And, and oftentimes from what I've learned from being on social media is you'll get something really negative, and the few times I have interacted, it's really just a gateway to then be like, I'm actually a
Yeah.
fan. And then you're like, wait, I'm so confused. You were so mean to me a few minutes ago. So I kind of try to remember that. I don't respond, but I try to remember that when you're receiving negativity like Oscar is giving to Rebecca in the beginning. Do you think, based on what we know about Virginie, that Rebecca is somewhat autofictional for her?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, right, she's not an actress, right?
Mhm.
So she's not going through that process of being prematurely put out to pasture because
Mhm.
there's no roles for her. But I think that, the sense that, and this is something that runs throughout her work, right? The sense that women are treated as disposable by our culture,
Mhm.
good for some things when they're at a certain age and then useless, right? I think that's
Mhm.
something that affects all of us, or that sense that there are these sort of fixed time markers in a woman's life, right? Like you
Mhm.
have to have, whatever, a successful career by this time and a, spouse by this time and a baby
Yep.
by this time and a thing. But, men are for the most part completely freed of those
Oh
expectations.
yeah.
People are watching you, right, to see if you've hit all your marks on time.
Yes, absolutely. And do you think this novel, especially Rebecca's excerpts, were cathartic in some way for Virginie?
I think they must have been because all her writing feels so cathartic to me.
Yeah.
There's so much healthy anger in her
Yeah.
work, which is why it's so exhilarating to read, because
Mhm.
sometimes like you're a person that has trouble being angry, which I sometimes am. I love the rage that
Yes.
that I can experience through her. So I think, yeah, there must have been some element of purging some of these, oppressive sentiments that she talks about.
Yeah. I someone recently shared a quote with me, and I'm paraphrasing probably awfully, but it was like the biggest lie we've told women as a society is that anger is not a real emotion.
Oh my
And I've always been drawn to female authors that are so generous with their anger because it's not represented very much and it's so cathartic for everyone, not just the woman who's writing about her experiences.
Yeah, I read somewhere that the thing about anger is that it's an emotion that wants to change things.
Mm,
It has a lot of energy behind it, right? We're
mm,
angry when we feel that something, it shouldn't be the way that it is, but also that it could be different, right? And so we want
difference.
to push it in a different
Yeah.
direction, right?
Absolutely. I love that. Zoe, Oscar's former publicist, writes a blog post accusing him of sexual harassment. We talked about him getting canceled. Oscar comes to Rebecca seeking sympathy, and of course, she has absolutely none to give, telling him if talented sociopaths can instinctively sniff out a perfect victim, you're the runt of the litter as narcissistic perverts go. I love that quote so much. But she also doesn't halt their conversation. She always emails back. And I think maybe it's possibly a nod to her addictive personality. They have a sort of codependency that is really fascinating. Despite Rebecca's blunt, harsh replies, Oscar says, whenever I feel like I'm going under, I email you. Who do you think is steering the ship of their codependency, or do you think the responsibility falls equally on the two of them?
That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things we learn in the book is that they're both addicts, right? He
Mhm.
is in recovery for what seems like alcohol addiction, and she, when the novel begins, has been using heroin nonstop for the last several decades, right? And
Mhm.
she says, sort of proudly, you know, I've got my life all sorted out. Heroin doesn't even really affect me negatively, so I can use all the time. It seems
Mhm.
as though the hook for her in the correspondence is how pathetic he is and how
Right.
needy he is. And she says a number of times that she's, you know, organized her life in such a way where no one's dependent on her. She doesn't have
Yeah.
a partner, she doesn't have kids, she doesn't really
Mhm.
seem to have many friends,
Mhm.
except, you know, her dealer and maybe a couple of other people that she uses.
Yeah.
But I think that the feeling of being needed draws her in. And that's exactly what codependency is. It's that desire
Yeah.
to be needed by someone.
And then you have Zoe, in contrast to both of them, who represents a younger generation that's all about a radical feminist ideology. Neither Rebecca nor Oscar understands, as she simultaneously gets trolled by Oscar's fans and is befriended by Rebecca, who admires her stability to stand up in the patriarchy. So, what do you think about Zoe's character? Like, I find it interesting that Rebecca is conflicted about aging out, but also still embraces the youthful energy of someone like Zoe.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I feel bad for Zoe. My heart
Mm.
goes out to her, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, she becomes famous in a way, right?
Mhm.
Because she calls out this guy on the internet and then almost immediately becomes beholden to this anonymous audience, right? Of
Yes.
fans, but also trolls and people who slide into her DMs and say wonderful things or say horrible things. And her whole life moves to the internet. And that's something that I think, you know, we see it all the time now, right? A lot of people's political lives are lived online, and it's a very
Yeah.
strange way to interact with people. And it seems as though over the course of the novel, it eventually kind of eats her up, you know, this
Yeah.
dependency on the opinions of strangers.
Yeah. And I think there's also a pressure put on people who do decide to speak out to then be a champion of the cause and become political. And as we were talking about someone like Virginie, who addresses the things that have happened to her but don't want to be defined by them because she is so much more expansive than these singular experiences that she was a victim of. Watching someone like Zoe become defined by this one instance in her life when she clearly has so much more to offer is really hard to watch. You want her to be able to grow beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, that because she gets notoriety for calling this guy
Mhm.
out, she then her whole life becomes reduced to this terrible event and she
Yeah.
can't move beyond it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, she does have my favorite line or like series of lines in the book. It's near the beginning where she says, "It's so we're so fucked up. Like, why is it that we scorn and humiliate girls whose boyfriends put them on the internet naked or like put videos of them giving blowjobs up on
True.
the internet?" And she says, "We should celebrate our young girls who give great blowjobs."
This book opened up sort of a conversation in my own head about that. And you see these predominantly male celebrities who have had something like that be leaked of them. And people are so quick to be like, don't look at that. That is horrible. That is such a breach of their privacy. And, a lot of the time respect that. And then it happens to a young woman and she's all the blame is put on her and people are constantly revisiting them and they're still circulating. And the double standard of that is the fact that that still exists today is really upsetting.
Yeah, no, it's horrific, you know? I mean, I think
Mhm.
just the idea that we view women's bodies as essentially not belonging to them, but as public
Yeah.
property, it lies
Yeah.
behind that response.
And I like that Virginie shows so many different versions of that, with Rebecca and Zoe generationally, how it affects women differently.
Yeah.
Speaking of, there's a line on page 63 where Rebecca says, I was beautiful before beauty became an Olympic
Oh,
sport.
yeah.
So she goes on to talk about how these young women coming onto the scene overthink how they present themselves as sexy, which takes away the sex appeal in her opinion. Can we talk about this a little bit? This commentary on beauty becoming so valuable and so manufactured that sex appeal and beauty now have very little crossover.
Yeah, there's this amazing part of her book King Kong Theory, which I love, and I was kind of rereading it like in preparation for our conversation. But she
Mhm.
says this thing, and I mean, I don't even know if I agree with it or not because it's just so sort of powerful and overwhelming. I need to think about it some more. But she says, on the one hand, women have never had more physical freedom than they
Mhm.
have now, right? You can drive your own car, you can get a
Mhm.
bank account in your own name, you can walk around, as you please, right? All of this stuff. And she says, it's not an accident that along with this incredible physical freedom, there's now all this pressure on women to do
Mhm.
everything that they can to make themselves beautiful and sexy, right? To
Mhm.
have, plastic surgery or any kind of
Mhm.
cosmetic procedure or to dress in a certain way. And she says, at no time in history has being let out of the cage gone unpunished.
Yeah,
So yeah,
so true.
it's so true, right? So like as we have more freedom, the more restrictions are then put on us.
Rebecca's character at one point Googles the etymology of addict. I found this really interesting. I sent this excerpt to so many people. And she explains that in the Middle Ages, a man who could not keep his promise was declared addictus and auctioned off. So being an addict is a way of relinquishing your power or trashing your privilege. It's rebellion, a way to reject your own interests and the interests of what society asks of you. She finishes the passage by saying, drugs are like violence, lawful when used by the state, criminal when used by the individual. What is your take on this?
I mean, I think it's absolutely true. And I think that there's some suggestion that addicts are treated in a way that's analogous to the way that women are treated, right? In this
Mhm.
kind of double bind where society wants you to be, a partier and wants you to be loose and wants you to have
Mhm.
fun, but doesn't want you to get carried away in the same way as women are expected to be fun and sexy, but not too sexy, right? Or
Mhm.
loving, but not too loving, or that, available, but not too
Yes.
available. So it's the
Yeah.
same kind of series of really, really unjust expectations that ultimately make life impossible for people.
I think the definition of sober has changed so much throughout the years. And, I've experienced it firsthand in my own family of what a doctor's definition of sober and the way that the government uses drugs versus recreational drug use and how kind of conflicting that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really true. I mean, I love Gabor Mate. He's a really wonderful psychologist and he
Mm.
talks a lot about addiction and trauma and all sorts
Mhm.
of other things. And one of the things that he says is everyone is either addicted to something or lying.
So
So,
so
yeah.
true.
So whether it's, drugs, booze, work, which is
Mhm.
totally mine, right? I
Mhm.
definitely use work to
Yeah.
cope. Or yeah, or whatever it is,
Yeah.
romantic relationships, right? Everybody looks outside themselves for something to make them feel better.
You so often see it just transferred into other things, and I think it's fascinating to watch the journey of both Oscar and Rebecca throughout this novel. Their addiction almost becomes the correspondence with each other. I have another quote. I've had wonderful friendships that span decades, and one day you meet up, and as you head home, you admit to yourself, I'm bored. I feel alone when I'm with you. You've lost all your sparkle. The friendship is over. I want to dissect this because it's such a common feeling. She just says it so unapologetically.
I had never had that experience until recently. I have a very old friend. We've been friends since we were 5 years old. We went through all of school together and have maintained a really close friendship. And I always thought she was the kind of friend where when I saw her, even if we hadn't spoken in a year, we could just fall into that groove, right?
Mhm.
And then a number of things happened. I got divorced and then started living essentially the life of like a single woman again.
Mhm.
And she's happily married, with her two children. And we kind of sat down for lunch. And I was just kind of like a mess, right? I mean, a happy
Like
mess.
a fun, hot, happy mess.
It was just suddenly the disconnect was so extreme because I think
Yeah.
for her, I had just absolutely, fallen off the wagon of being a grown up,
Of the trajectory that
Oh,
you're expected to be
yes.
on.
It's the first time I had that experience, and it really affected me. I felt really bad afterward.
Yeah. It's quite harsh, especially when it happens. You're not feeling, oh, we're growing distant, especially with those friends that you can go months without talking, and then it's like you just pick up where you left off. And then there's other instances like the one you experienced where you realize maybe we were only friends because of all the things we had in common.
Yes.
And if we no longer have those things in common, how do we connect? And it's
Yeah.
really, friendship breakups are really harsh and sad.
Yeah, they're the most painful. And it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to find people that you connect with on, I mean, it's not that, it's not like common interests are superficial, but I think that there is a core self,
Hmm.
right? And it's really hard to find people that you connect with on that soul level, such that
Hmm.
even if circumstances change and you take different paths in life, you still recognize each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it just becomes harder as you get older to make friends that you can have that deep connection with. And age obviously comes up a lot throughout the novel. At one point, Rebecca refers to someone getting old. She says they got old because they stopped going to concerts and watching movies. I actually think there's truth in this. When you're young, newness sort of just falls into your life. Like you're not having to make that much of an effort to seek it out like you do as you get older. What do you think Virginie is trying to get at by relating aging to a lack of activity and inspiration?
Well, she has this series of books called the Vernon Subutext trilogy,
Mhm.
and they're kind of all about the way that people live their lives through pop music. And I
Mhm.
think she's somebody who believes so much in a kind of ongoing relationship to rock and roll or pop or culture more generally, movies. And there is something in that that I think is really true, that when you stop engaging with culture, part of you dies, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that that is something that we all experience as we get older and busier.
Yeah.
There's not to say we don't have time to check out the new band, or we have to
Yeah.
get up early the next day, or we
Yeah.
watch the movie on Netflix and we're like on our phone half the time, or
Yeah.
putting it on and off. So
Yeah.
our lives overwhelm us and they push
Yes.
out the space that used to exist for new experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And now sort of getting into the end of the book, I think the last paragraph in the book is extremely hopeful and positive despite the anger that came before it. Um, she says it was all there in that one moment, a glorious life from every point of view, made up of sated desires and passions that shatter me, fill me, create me, encounters like sweet collisions and curiosities, and it all exists in me. You can count on me, and yes, we could meet up someday. You're right, these emails are starting to feel a little cramped. In one early review I read online, they say, what if we took more time to meet people where they are without demanding they fit into a prescribed version of how they should be? Oscar and Rebecca's relationship is one version of what this can look like. They start out at two completely different places in life, two completely different people, and yet find common ground and can withhold this connection over the course of this entire book. Um, they don't agree on so many major issues, but at the end of the novel, they've accepted each other's flaws and grown as humans. Do you think this way of interpreting the book wraps it up in too neat of a bow, or do you think the hope is ideal in a good way?
Yeah, I think it's ideal in a good way. I mean, I found it to be such a sweet book ultimately,
Yeah.
as well as a really fascinating one and an impassioned one, but I found it really sweet and really tender. And I think that so much of the book is about the idea of repair. Oscar's done this shitty thing,
Hmm.
right? He's done this really, really shitty thing to Zoe, and it has affected her life in a really, really terrible way.
Hmm.
At the same time, both of them have the rest of their lives to live. So how do live on past a traumatic event happening to you if you're
Hmm.
Zoe, but also how do you live on if you've been the person that has perpetrated the trauma,
Yeah.
if you're the dickhead,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And the truth is most of us will have been some version of the dickhead at some point in our lives,
Yeah.
right? So how do we then, if we want to, how do we decide to be different and do better and have healthier, more compassionate relationships? And I think what's really lovely about this book is it believes that that's possible for people
Hmm.
and that it doesn't happen overnight, but that people do change, which is
Yeah.
something I think we have trouble believing in, the
Yeah.
capacity of people to change for the better. And
Yeah.
believes in that, which I think is really, really powerful.
Yeah. And I think we have such an aversion to taking accountability.
Yeah.
And I actually think the two go hand in hand, where, like, if you want to move on, at least for me, moving on from traumatic experiences also meant having to take accountability and responsibility for the times that I was more of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And it's empowering to do both. And, like, that's how we move forward. You can't very few people are one or the other. And I
Yeah.
think recognizing that both of those things exist in all of us is what allows us to move forward. And that's, yeah, I felt like it was quite sweet for Virginie to end it this way. And like my heart was warm and I was like, this is very sentimental in a way.
Yeah, no, I felt that way too. I felt like, gosh, I really feel, optimistic about humanity after reading
Yeah.
the book. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If you could recommend any Virginie book or film as an introduction to her work, what would you recommend we watch or read?
Probably I brought it out with me. Probably
Okay.
King Kong
Yeah.
Theory. I love, right?
Yeah.
It's like you could sort of think of it as like a book of essays or a manifesto, and
Mhm.
it's really quotable. It's one of those books that you just keep sending screenshots to your friends, and
Yeah.
it draws on her history of sexual assault, but it also draws on her experiences as a sex worker in ways that are really interesting. And there's a lot of really, really provocative thinking about feminism and culture in it. And it's really like light. You could fit it in your pocket or in a little bag. And so
Yeah.
I love that book. I think it's terrific.
What book are you currently reading?
What book am I currently reading? I'm currently reading this book called The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell that came out in 2007 or 2008. And
Mhm.
it's a 1,000-page novel written from the perspective
Oh,
of an SS officer. And it's incredibly disturbing and upsetting, but I also think one of the most ethical books I've ever read. And
wow.
yeah, and it's grueling. I'm 700
Yeah.
pages in. I have 300 pages left to go. It's very, very painful, but it does feel like it's a book that forces you to confront, it's like the opposite of the end of Dear Dickhead. It forces you to confront the absolute worst of humanity from within that perspective.
Yes.
And it's really just blown me away. I think it's
Yeah.
astonishing.
And then last one, what is the book that you've gifted the most to people?
What is the book that I've gifted the most to people? Oh, it's a book by Robert Gluck called Marjorie Kemp, and
I read it.
it's like it's filthy. It's absolutely filthy. It
Perfect.
it's about like it's a retelling of the life of this medieval woman writer, Marjorie Kemp, who's the first woman who writes her autobiography in English,
Hmm.
coupled with Gluck's, story of this affair that he's having. And in the book, he kind of writes about Marjorie's love for Jesus Christ as though it's his love for his lover. And so
Whoa.
there's all, Marjorie's having sex with Jesus, and it's really
Wow.
graphic. And so it's a certain kind of person that you give that book to, but it's
That's honestly though, I love recommending like either really filthy or strange books to people because I do think it shows you who understands your brain in a specific way. And I've accidentally sometimes like I think I read something and I love it so much and I maybe forget why and I'll like recommend it to my mom and she's like texting me quotes from it and I'm like, "Oh."
oh,
But she's fortunately one of the freaks like us who appreciates those
cool.
things. So,
Yeah, my
um,
mom is not. There's definitely
no.
times where I've recommended stuff to my mom and I think it's just been too rich for her blood. Like she can't.
Oh, she's like, mm-mm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This was so fun and so easy, and
Oh
you're
man, this was
wonderful.
wonderful. Thank you so much for having
Of
me on.
course.
Yeah.
Talk
See
soon.
you
Bye.
later.